You're listening to Puma Podcast.
Hi, I'm Bella Perez Rubio, Puma Podcast, and you're listening to Teka Teka. It's well documented that Chinese operatives are working overtime to run influence campaigns in the Philippines. But what narratives are they spreading, and what do they hope to achieve?
So I think the
Yeah.
China challenge is three levels. So you have the maritime issue, you have the economic issue, and then you have the democratic issue. That's what we're not
Mhm.
talking about when we talk about disinformation, when we talk about cognitive warfare, when we talk about the united front, and when we
Yeah.
talk about Chinese propaganda. The aim really is to shape democracy and shape public opinion and elect leaders that will be friendly towards China so that we shift Philippine foreign policy favorable to China.
China's ambitions also hinge on the vulnerabilities of its fiercest rival and our closest ally, the United States. Robin Garcia, founder and chairman of the public opinion research firm WR Numero, says the re-election of Donald Trump to the presidency will provide China's influence operations in the Philippines with a fresh round of ammunition.
So China is really going to bank on the election of Trump, the hypocrisy of the U.S. and things like that. So anything that China could catch as a potential source of bringing down the U.S. and bringing down the current system, China will do that and capitalize on that. We wanted to map out the two things, to ask two questions. One is, what are the narratives China is propagating in the Philippines? And number two, how are people accepting? But it's two studies because it requires different treatment.
Robin worked on these two studies with WR Numero's president and CEO, Cleve Arguelles. For these studies, they used data from their public opinion surveys and big data analytics. Here's what that means.
This is data from social media, specifically on Facebook, no? And we tried to map these narratives from. We wanted to go as far back as 2022 or even earlier 2017. But in the interest of time, what we got is data from January 2024 up until now, which is almost a more than half a million engagements on Facebook, specifically from several sets of Facebook assets. No, so these are all pro-China Facebook assets. So may they be pages, news pages, or individuals talking, or organizations that we know have links or have been propagating pro-China narratives. No? Firm WR has a proprietary methodology and software to understand and categorize comments on social media. No? So we use third-party softwares, but we also have our own software that could read the sentiments online. No?
Yeah.
So that's why it's big data, because we could look at millions of engagements and conversations in just a few days. No?
Yeah.
But really, the reason why we looked at it is because there's a dearth in that data. There's a big gap in the conversation right now. Because a lot of the studies, even academic studies and studies from think tanks, they focus on how China is propagating their narratives, which means that they focus on the resources, the material resources that China uses. So that's demonstrated by the hiring of troll farms, by the co-opting of organizations to and other coalitions to support China, right? So these are sort of the resources, the coalitions, the platforms that are being used on Facebook, YouTube, or TikTok. But the current conversation in studies do not have a comprehensive idea of what these narratives are to begin with. China saying, what are they trying to really make us believe, including artificial intelligence? So these are approaches. Instead of asking, not the resources, not the methods, but what are the narratives? So that's what we really wanted to focus on.
What they found were six key narratives propagated by 11 major actors.
So the first one is a systematic discrediting of the United States.
Mm.
Pro China groups, they've been investing on discrediting the US, the
Mm.
moral position of the US
Yeah.
in the Philippines. So these are narratives talking about the hypocrisy of the US, that they aim to fix the domestic and local maybe landscape of the Philippines when it comes to human rights and other things, but they couldn't fix their own problems domestically. So that makes up actually a chunk of all of the engagements, no, of all of the narratives.
Mm.
Specifically, 23%. There are many sub narratives under that, but the big narrative is that basically the US is not a reliable partner.
Mm.
It's interfering with the domestic sphere. It's hypocritical and things like that. The second one
Mhm.
is criticizing President Marcos or the current
Okay.
administration and his efforts to counter China. So that makes up 22%. So
Mm.
China is trying to systematically discredit President Bongbong Marcos and his
Yeah.
pivot back to the United States and his
Yeah.
more confrontational approach towards China. And
Mhm.
obviously, all of the narratives that this government have tried to have released, no, have also tried to have published that goes counter to China and counters Chinese interests is something that's being negated by China systematically.
The third, fourth, and fifth narratives all focus on boosting China's image. 17% dedicated to praising the benefits of cooperation with China and its intentions as an economic partner, while 14% each promote a pacifist approach toward China and further highlight its achievements as a developing country.
And then you have the last one, which is promoting Asia for Asians. So it's basically a pan-Asian narrative
Okay.
saying
Yeah.
that Western countries should not interfere, that this is the Asian century, that Asians
Mhm.
should work together, against our colonial masters and things like that.
Mhm. Okay.
So that makes up 9%, and then
9%.
the rest are mixed narratives. These
Okay.
are smaller narratives,
Yeah.
but these are the six major narratives. My hypothesis is that even during the Duterte administration, these are also the narratives that the pro-China groups have propagated in the Philippines.
And what can you tell us about the main actors pushing these narratives? Do you name them in your study? Are some of them recognizable figures or are they all anonymous?
Actually, we named them in the study, and this
Hmm.
is also based on the existing studies.
Okay.
For example, we also based these actors because it's actually very similar, no? And
Mhm.
they're very conspicuous. They don't hide their pro-China
Yeah.
character. So these are, of course, China state-owned media who have pages
Mhm.
here,
Yeah.
no? Media or China state-backed organizations. So
Mhm.
these are China Daily, of course, the Chinese Embassy in Manila, who has their own Facebook page.
Yeah.
They also have CGTN, China Global
Yeah.
TV Network, who has a presence in the Philippines. And
Mhm.
then you have CRI Filipino Services. No? So these are China state owned or China state backed organizations or media. And then
Yeah.
there's also pro China based organizations who we know have links to China. No? So, for example, GTNR, so Global Talk News Radio, Asian Century Philippines. So it's a non-profit organization. You also have the Philippine China Friendship Club
Mm.
and the think tank, the pro-China think tank, Integrated Development Studies Institute. And then you have known pro-Duterte and pro-China social media personalities. I think they're pretty much well known. No?
We get into what these findings mean after a quick break. Robin Garcia, founder and chairman of the public opinion research firm WR Numero, argues that the narrative spread by China reveal its perception of the Philippines, the current administration, and the country's political landscape.
I think China wants us to go back to the more accommodationist foreign policy of President Duterte. Really, I think that's the first thing that they want to achieve. China is using the cognitive sphere or public opinion in
Yeah.
order to achieve its interests in the Philippines and in other countries. So their interest is to have a region where that's a little bit more friendly and
Mhm.
receptive to their own foreign policy objectives, to
Yeah.
Chinese foreign policy objectives.
Can you also give us an idea of how deeply embedded these narratives and the main actors pushing these narratives are in major conversations that are happening in the country right now? So, if I were to give an example, the investigation of Pogos or the ongoing criticism of Vice President Sara Duterte because of her father's West Philippine Sea policy and indications that she's given that her views are the same. I think those are conversations that have been happening over the last few months. Are these actors and these narratives deeply embedded in those conversations, or are they happening outside of those conversations?
I think they have their own silo. I think they have their own ecosystem.
Yeah.
And yes, it does travel into mainstream sometimes.
Mhm.
But we've seen that the reason why they created sort of alternative venues to vent and to
Yeah.
publish their thoughts is because they're having difficulty getting more positive reception in mainstream media,
Mm.
right? So that's
Yeah.
why they are in digital. But in other studies, China has actually tapped mainstream media through content
Mm.
partnerships. But even Inquirer has a
Mm.
partnership
Mm.
with a China-owned media organization. And there are many examples of that. But most of these conversations, especially now, are not in mainstream
Mm.
and are in sort of alternative venues
Mm.
in social media and alternative think tanks. During the Duterte administration, we know that a lot of Duterte aligned individuals and organizations have been promoting pro China narratives, and that only means that during that time it was more mainstream compared to
Yeah.
this time.
But how do these narratives and being able to identify them and the actors behind them and where they exist, how does that, if at all, color all the information that you've gathered about Filipino views on China, China policy, pro China politicians, which I notice you've been very good about tracking in your public opinion monitor?
Consistent data in Philippine Public Opinion Monitor that a lot of Filipinos still mistrust China and mistrust its leader,
Mhm.
right? I think it talks
Yeah.
about the ineffectiveness of Chinese public diplomacy in the Philippines. I think that China has not figured out how to talk to Filipinos,
Mhm.
how to cultivate its
Yeah.
soft power, how to cultivate that positive perception. It is trying to
Yeah.
do that by talking about positive narratives like Asia for Asians, the achievements of China, and things like that. But I think the reason why it
Yeah.
hasn't really been as effective is because it has contradictory actions, in the West Philippine Sea and in other
Mm.
places. And yeah, China really just has a bad brand. So if ever there's some support for China, it's more the instrumental side, something that they could get, a country that they could get
Mm.
out, something out from, including jobs, including some form of investments. But even investments is already called into question
Mm.
because there were really no investments that came out at the tail end of the Duterte administration. So yeah, so I think that's
Yeah.
what I would say regarding the ineffectiveness of Chinese public opinion. So I think China has to do a better job in enlisting more support. I don't think it
Yeah.
understands the Philippines. I don't think any of its communicative interventions have been effective, and we see that in the
Yeah.
data. So yeah, under
Yeah.
Xi Jinping, I don't expect any improvement and any more conscious effort aside from propaganda to improve the public
Hmm.
diplomacy of China in the Philippines.
I asked Robin what motivated them to conduct these studies on China's propaganda and why Filipinos should care about what China is trying to achieve.
Really, it's really an exciting time to study Chinese narratives because people feel that China's coercion is manifested only in the maritime sphere. But in fact, its
Mm,
coercion is also manifested in the democratic or cognitive sphere. That China
yeah.
is using democracy and trying to shape public opinion in order to get what it wants. And in fact, it's
Yeah.
better for China because if it's successful in shaping cognition, then it will have spent
Mm,
less and spent more less effort, diba, in getting what it wants. It's the same strategy in
yeah.
Taiwan. If China successfully gets Taiwan to elect a pro-China
Mm,
candidate, then that's the best route for them because it didn't have to attack Taiwan, and then Taiwan will
yeah.
voluntarily surrender its sovereignty. The
Mm,
China issue is a multifaceted issue that goes beyond the
yeah.
maritime sovereignty and security sphere, but also include the democratic sphere, and even something we're not even talking about is the economic sphere. That we think that it's okay to be permissive in economics, but then
Mm,
confrontational in maritime security. I think that's a mistake
yeah.
because China can weaponize its ownership of many things in the Philippines, like energy and telecoms,
Yeah.
against the Philippines to get what it wants.
You mentioned very briefly earlier some factors that might affect how effective these narratives are. So, right now, it seems like we're impervious to these narratives or they're not doing a very good job. But you mentioned, for example, the election of Donald Trump and how that might help the narrative that the US is not a reliable partner, right? What are the other factors that you foresee that might affect how effective these
Yeah,
narratives
so,
are?
so other factors is obviously if there's a shift in the tide of public opinion in the Philippines without China doing anything. So for
Mm,
example, if democratic forces just lose, they run
mm,
out of anything good to say, for example. And my fear is that the Philippine domestic politics is slowly becoming that there's a dearth of very effective opposition
mm,
towards the current system or the current political landscape
yeah.
because there's no persuasive and very effective organized opposition aside from Duterte.
Mm-hmm.
That's a problem because then it
Yeah.
enables forces rather who are less steadfast in their morality, to win
Yeah.
elections.
How does it affect the state of things, do you think, that, many people now say, for example, that the Dutertes are the opposition now? People are making that argument. How does that affect the contents of your study, what you're tracking here, considering that they have been known to make
Yeah.
some pro China argument?
If Duterte succeeds at opposing, then it would
Mm.
have been they will be more convincing, and it would also signal that
Mm.
the pro-China coalition has taken more ground, more power in the Philippines,
Yeah.
and so that's good for China, and that's bad for Philippine sovereignty.
That was today's episode of Teka Teka. Again, I'm Bella Perez Rubio. If you want to hear more about the innovative research WR Numero is conducting, look into previous episodes we've done covering their public opinion polls. We'll leave those links for you in the show notes. Pidoy Blanco edited this episode. Jill Caro is our executive producer. And if you have a friend who might be interested in hearing about this study and its findings, it would be so helpful if you sent them this episode. Thanks for listening.